All right, so 25 minutes, lot to get through.
We're the ones that wear the suits.
Yeah, we're the suits. So I'd start by saying thanks to BRPTA, our PRBTA, Keiko and the team have done an excellent job. We're really proud to be part of the community here. Puerto Rico, from a client and business standpoint, is very important to Kraken. Kraken's one of the largest and oldest centralized exchanges in the crypto community. We've been around for 13 years. We operate a global business, and we're looking forward to regulatory clarity. We heard a little bit about that previously. We're very active on the policy front, North America, Europe, and Australia, which are our core markets. I also want to thank our partners at Porzio, Bill, and the team, and our advisors and partners here in Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Rican government. I think the advancement in forward-looking regulations, which support responsible innovation and growth in this space, have been meaningful. And I think we've seen investment and growth here, and look forward to continue to support that investment and growth. So with that, I think we're going to start high level with Don. It's an honor to interview someone that's been at the sort of intersection of law, politics, and business for most of his career. Really fascinating experience, and very impactful in terms of the makeup and architecture of the judicial branch of government today. So we wanted to start high level, first 100 days, what to expect with the Trump administration. A lot of activity. A lot of us in the industry are sort of busier on offense than we were on defense. And then kind of get into the judicial branch, Chevron doctrine, what changes to that and other Supreme Court cases will have on impact in administrative law going forward, and then kind of bringing it to the third point of what this all means for crypto in our industry. So, Don, first 100 days, I think you said first 100 hours.
First 100 minutes. First 100 minutes. You say first 100 days, and I see the series of smirks just kind of going off the room, saying, "Wow, this is no longer the benchmark of 100 days, right? Coming quickly. A lot of executive orders, a lot of executive action. Most, if you paid attention to what President Trump did last time, what he said on the campaign trail this time, should not be too much of a surprise. There are some curveballs. I must admit, I had on my tic-tac-toe board, I did have Greenland. I did have Panama Canal. I did not have Gulf of America as the three on that. Circle did not get the square on that one for me. But everything else, for as bold as it is, if you are paying attention, there is kind of common themes there. He was very clear this is what he was going to do. It's what he's doing. Let's talk a minute about executive orders, what they are and what they are not. They don't make new law. They're not legislation. They're not pronouncements of the crown. If you do nothing but watch cable news all day, you can really work yourself into a lather over what's going on. I would recommend not doing that, instead focusing more on the substance this time around. The running joke in D.C. is if you thought season 1 was something, where do you see season 2? And certainly episode 1 of season 2 has certainly gotten off with a bang through a lot of these executive orders. Many of these orders simply task agencies within the executive branch to study an issue, take a look at an issue, and report back. They don't create new standards and new rules. Some are a little more aggressive than that, but many of these are, the subject matter is not necessarily a standard issue, but they are a professional work product that look a lot like every other executive order every other president has done. Although there's a lot more of them all at once in areas that others had not really touched. There'll be more coming as far as various timelines. I know there's still several executive orders still working its way through the process. So they're going to be more substantive in various other areas. Right now, there's a lot of ink being spilled in the press over Doge, Elon Musk's project. He has been appointed by the president to run that. He seems to be spending his time on personnel issues, we'll call it that, offering people kind of pseudo buyouts. They're not technically buyouts, but what he calls the fork in the road. Now they're upping it to say they may sort of relieve people of their duties. He's helping sort of move people around and out the door. So far, the Doge operation doesn't seem to have gotten into policy, but it's probably only a matter of time. The challenge there is they don't really have statutory authority to get into policy. You really have to look at the regulatory agencies. The EO that probably is most exciting to everyone here is the crypto EO. There's a working group that's been established between Treasury, SEC, CFPB, and I just heard that the chairman of the relevant committees in the House and Senate, Frenchell and Tim Scott, have now sort of added themselves, or have been added somehow to this working group. They were probably feeling a little left out because there was legislation kind of moving a certain way, and then the EO maybe was perceived as kind of putting a pause on some of that. So this issue set is hot for a bunch of reasons. First, very few people in Washington understand it. So there's a strength in that, there's a weakness in that. The strength is because they don't understand it, they don't really know yet what they're doing, so they don't have bad habits that they have to unlearn. The downside is when they don't really know what they're doing, they can sort of accidentally do things that hurt, get in the way, think they're helping when they're not helping, and that sort of thing. Second, it's new. So what I look for in the first 100 days are agencies urged by executive order or of their own accord, trying to do things in the regulatory area that may or may not come within their statutory grants of authority. Agencies don't exist because they exist. They exist because a statute was written. Statute gives them certain authorities. So the Department of Redundancy Department can't simply pass a reg saying, cracking's illegal, right? That's not how it works. If you watch the news, you would think maybe that's how it works. So, and the third, of course, is the courts and what they're going to do with all this. Legislatively, we can get more into detail kind of, I think, at the end, but it is an unprecedented amount of paper coming out of the White House. The difference between what I'll respectfully call season 1 versus season 2 is the White House team has its act together exponentially more than the crew I was a part of had. They know each other. They did the campaign together. There's a level of trust. They're not leaking. They're not backstabbing each other. Susie Wiles is clearly in charge as chief of staff. Dave Warrington's clearly the counsels of the president. And then there's other folks. Stephen Miller is clearly the man to see on policy. And then everyone else is supporting them and supporting the president. Whereas in season 1, you had a number of factions kind of cobbled together at the 11th hour during transition. And it was not a White House that really spoke with one voice when giving advice to the president. So this time, the president, I think, is getting much more of a unified, well-staffed out approach. And this is why these executive orders can come so fast. And so far, I think they've actually done pretty well. They've had a couple foot fouls. OMB, Office of Management and Budget, put out a memo about the spending freeze. They got a little carried away, apparently did not run through the White House process. This managed to get out in the newspapers. So I think they're making some corrective action there. That resulted in a couple courts enjoining a couple things. That's kind of the price of living in the big city. That was probably expected. Otherwise, they've actually done a very good job of rolling out what they want to do in their own terms without all the drama that was around the first time around.
And so, Don, I think that, one of the things we're seeing right now is a very active forward-looking agenda for the crypto industry. Over 2 congressional cycles, 4 years, there's been an immense amount of work, bipartisan work, House, Senate, and the industry to get legislation done. And I think that coherence, that organization at the executive branch and within the White House is critical to that speed. But there's also a desire to take an accounting and audit of what just happened for the last 4 years. And debanking is one of these topics that's coming up. And I think there's stories about debanking both at the personal level, for many executives and founders in the crypto community, as well as an enterprise level. It is important to make sure the facts are found and the trend doesn't continue. What are your thoughts on this trend, and what do you expect in terms of outcomes?
Debanking is hot right now. There's a lot of politics around it, as with seemingly everything in modern American society. Everything seems to go into partisan camps instantly. AI may be the only one that folks have not figured out yet how to weaponize for political gain. I'm sure AI will tell them how to do it shortly, and then they'll figure it out. There was a hearing today, Senate Banking Committee chaired by Senator Scott. And if you really, either you're sleep deprived and want to fall asleep, or you're very interested and you want to watch C-SPAN 3 at 4 o'clock in the morning, we'll probably rebroadcast it. It actually shows you where things probably are headed over the next several months. Because you had the Republicans, their questions showed that they think the debanking problem is the fault of the government. The regulators have gotten carried away. The laws are kind of vague. The laws are kind of draconian, and they kind of push people to debank and not take any chances. You hear sub-strains of that on the Republican side, the populist strain saying it hurts the smaller banks because they can't afford to make a mistake. You have, it hurts the consumers because the smaller account holders are gonna be out in the cold. On the other side of the aisle, it was Elizabeth Warren and for the most part, the other Democrats. Senator Warner's probably an exception to this, where we need more regulation, more agencies, more rules, more this, more that. And then sprinkled in on both sides of the aisle to a certain extent is and then there's crypto with a lot of sort of word fog. Senator Warner talked in terms of national security, that we can't trace it, that kind of thing. I'm paraphrasing, not using his words. He's much more articulate on it than I possibly could be. Senator Kennedy, the Louisiana Republican, had an op-ed today in the Wall Street Journal, squarely blaming the government for the debanking issue. But then in the course of his questioning, he kind of sounded like he switched positions and said, well, this one incident sounds like maybe it was the bank's fault. So why does that matter to this group? Crypto is baked into this debanking thing, whether you like it or not, because it is kind of a thing the politicians just will say, well, but crypto, as if somehow that's an explanation. And that's kind of the level of understanding I think they have now. But you see already the kind of camps forming where one side's blaming the government, the other side's blaming the banks. And right now, the side blaming the government, somewhat ironically now, controls the government. So you look for this being more of a government reform sort of thing. So to the extent that there is, an opportunity, if you want to get on the sheet of music with the current majority, blame the government, don't blame the banks.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this topic underscores, again, here in the United States, the need for regulatory clarity, because I think if you have foundational regulation of centralized intermediaries and a clear registration framework, there's less propensity to try to regulate an industry through the banking system, right, and quote unquote de-risk an unregulated industry. And I think the irony here is, despite the United States leadership in many areas of technology and innovation, Europe passed legislation 2 years ago. The UK has moved forward. Canada has regulatory clarity. Australia is moving forward. A number of other jurisdictions in G10 and beyond have advanced clear rules of the road, while this has become a political football. And hopefully we see a trend towards crypto being nonpartisan. Switching gears, maybe to the judicial branch, major changes for the lawyers amongst us, Chevron doctrine, a huge sort of pillar of administrative law. How do you see those changes impacting the forward-looking agenda, particularly under this administration?
Well, there's an interesting tension, which I think will resolve itself, between a president who very much believes in presidential authority under the Constitution and courts that are very skeptical of bureaucratic executive power. So you have courts now that are much more wired to be skeptical of government action. By way of numbers, if you look at the appellate judges in the United States, about 1/3 were appointed by President Trump. And mostly all of them are kind of cut from this block of wood that says the administrative state's too big, too unwieldy, too unfair, and tends to be sort of the Orwellian boot continuing to stomp on everybody. But the Supreme Court has also been very strong on core presidential power. See the immunity decision that got a lot of ink last year, which, despite all the media back and forth, it actually was pretty consistent with what the Supreme Court had said before. So it was portrayed as something that broke a lot of new ground. But to some of us, it just sort of memorialized what a lot had already thought the law probably was. So when this all goes to court, whatever this may be, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. You will have judges enjoining things coming out of the executive branch. You will have tweets, X's, whatever we call them now, Truth Socials criticizing those courts. And that's just kind of how the sausage is going to be made. I think at the end of the day, the Supreme Court will be called upon to weigh in on a lot of things. We're at a point, I think, in American history where there's a lot of change, and when you live through the change, you don't quite see how much there is. And you look back in history, you remember from history books the election of 1896 when McKinley won, kind of ushered in the industrial age. Woodrow Wilson won because Teddy Roosevelt was a third-party candidate. We got really the birth of the progressive movement in the 1920s. FDR coming to power in the New Deal for multiple presidential terms. And then really we've been kind of floundering around, and now sort of the Trump effect is something we really cannot comprehend. I mean, 2 years on the campaign plus 4 years of a first term, 4 years of Biden, sort of, but Trump still really dominated. President Trump still really dominated the discussion, right? So he wasn't president, but a lot of people still acted like he was, and he certainly, in the eyes of the media, drove a lot of the conversation. Now he's going to be president for the next term, and the actions he's doing now are not going to be sorted out in the courts with finality for years. So there'll be another couple years after where you do 2 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 2. That is a big chunk of our lifetime. So whether you like them or don't like them or agree or don't agree, you have to face reality that this is you're living in a moment where the two-party system has really de-aligned. How it's realigning, no one has really figured it out. The only one who's really figured it out twice was President Trump. He did it in 16, did it in 24. If you ask him, he did it in 20. Joe Biden showed up anyway, so we can leave that for another day. But the courts are going to really decide where the lines are, what this means for crypto, other digital currency, emerging technology. Is you can urge agencies to do things. Agencies may do things you like and may be struck in court because the agency really doesn't have the authority to do it. Or the statute, they want to read it a certain way, but a court says that goes too far. It used to be that courts gave a tremendous amount of deference to the agencies, commonly called the Chevron doctrine. Chevron was a case from the early 80s over smokestacks and pollution. The EPA took a deregulatory position. The Supreme Court upheld it and gave them deference on that. And then that turned into a whole new kind of power where the agencies were able to kind of expand the rules to the point where there were some fishermen in southern New Jersey who had to pay a government inspector to be on their boat. And that ended up being this case called Lauper, where they said to the Supreme Court, that is not in their statute. And the government said, well, close enough for government work. The close enough for government work standard is no longer the standard. But Lauper is really one case of what has been an administrative law revolution. Everything from when you get a right to a jury trial if you're messing with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is something you may say today, why do I care? Well, the SEC, they may, somebody's nodding like, yeah, they may come a knocking someday. To a whole host of other cases that really have redefined administrative law in a way that really hasn't happened since really the beginning of FDR's administration. So what does that mean here? It means that you have a lot of statutes and a lot of agencies that really were created long before all this was created. So how does that fit in? And when the government tries to sort of put old rules onto new things, usually doesn't work out so well in the courts. So we shall see. But the courts will, I think, my guess is if the president is exercising authority in a statute or in the Constitution, they're going to uphold it. People miss this. There's a lot of statutes that give the president tremendous authority. Tariffs, for example, this has been in the news. Tariffs is a taxing power in the Constitution. It's part of the taxing clause. Presidents don't unilaterally just get to do tariffs. This was news to some. But then you realize there's statutes that give the president the authority through the Department of Commerce, Trade Rep, Department of Treasury a little bit to work up some reports, find some facts, and then impose tariffs. When Congress has given that authority to the president, it ought not be a surprise that he exercises that authority. So this will all play out in the courts, but Trump is actually so far on much more solid ground on what he's doing than a lot of the media pundits think, because they really haven't read the law. Even with the courts kind of changing and being much more hostile to bureaucratic rule, top-down rule in the executive branch, remember, he runs the executive branch, that I think has better chance in court. So we shall see.
So, I think 4 years can go very quickly. I know there's a lot of excitement in the industry. I think it's important for our industry to understand that 4 years goes fast. There's midterm elections.
And the Senate, I mean, we love the Senate, but they're designed to do one thing a week. Look at the Senate rules. That's really kind of that's kind of how they're set up. They like to do everything unanimous consent. So yeah, 4 years goes like that, because you really have, Congress kind of goes in waves, and they have recess at they call it working period now, off-year elections, things, and then the second 2 years, who knows what's going to happen right now. If you look at the congressional maps, it's looking okay for Republicans, but there's no guarantees. 4 years, if you really do calendar days, is even quicker than, your point. I take your point and I raise your point. It's a lot faster than you think.
And I think, like, from our industry's perspective, the urgency, again,
Yeah.
to get legislation done, particularly when most developed markets and economies have already advanced clear rules. There's a lot of excitement. I think, the industry's focused on getting just the foundational pieces done. It is a very broad and diverse ecosystem with a number of different players. But some of the initiatives that have been led by Chairman Hill, Chairman Scott, Subcommittee Chairman Senator Lummis on the Senate side, these just put basic foundational pieces in place. We don't have to solve every aspect of this, right? So let's exempt DeFi and technology the same way Europe has done. Let's let the studies do their work over time, but let's put the basic rules in place, end the lawsuits, and make real policy. With the horizon, what would be your advice to the industry, just given that timeline? We got to pass legislation, get regulation done. Is it act fast?
The more you can find common ground, the more you can get things done. Any new emerging technology industry, in this case, form of currency, the perception is it's all the same thing if you're over a certain age, and it's not all the same thing. But there has to be common ground, because otherwise you're going to step all over each other and then kind of make it worse. It reminds me in a way of what happened in the late 90s. It's my one foray into registering to lobby, actually, was internet, with the emergence of the internet, the phone companies, who was going to be liable for content. And I remember being involved in crafting what became Section 230 that took the internet service providers and the phone companies out of being liable. And there were all sorts of trade groups and all sorts of peoples, some knew what they were doing, some were selling snake oil. And there was enough sense, and they hired enough of the right people to get it together so that they're able to exempt themselves. And the 230 protection then kind of went beyond what originally I think people thought it was supposed to do, because the statutory text goes beyond it. And we're still talking about it today. So in this world, I feel like you're at the same kind of crossroads. What's different is you have semi-unified government. I say semi because the majorities in the House and Senate are quite slim. The Senate has all its procedural rules that kind of don't allow majority rule just to do things. But in a way, it's easier to seize the moment now than it probably was in the 2000s. But I would look, you look at these sort of how Congress has handled things. It tells me you can actually pass legislation. But if everyone's stepping all over each other, then you're going to be back to square one and be perceived as kind of wild, wild west that,
It's a really important point. I mean, in the 3 years I've been at Kraken, there's been a big maturity in the industry lobby. We're proud members of the Blockchain Association, which now has over 100 members. And the first thing I heard, I remember my first
I was
2 weeks
impressed.
on
I
the
saw the previous panel. I didn't have my reading glasses on. I didn't see the names, but the guy in the middle, I mean, he was going a mile a minute on every bill. I mean, clearly they got their act together. I mean,
It's-
he was, if you can keep up with the auctioneer pace, I mean, he was, he knew what was coming next, so it was.
You got to
it
have a
was
lot of
impressive.
energy
It was
in this game.
impressive.
You got to have a lot of energy in this game. But I think, to underscore that point, it's really important to speak with a unified voice.
Yeah.
And hammer out positions, because that's what the stakeholders want, right? The House and the Senate want consensus. And I
They
think-
do, and you got to make it easy for them, right? Because right now, the Senate banking hearing, to me, I don't want to make it sound like it's that important, but it's important enough that you see the theme right now on Capitol Hill is much more who to blame for whatever, right? And it's an opportunity for the Republicans to say Biden years are really bad, the agencies are out of control. The banking hearing had very little to do with banking or the substance, had everything to do with kind of, where to push the blame. But there is a need for the second step, which is more substance, and try to find common ground among the various factions in the family, because I think there is a real need for it. I think every elected official wants to look hip, wants to kind of know what they're talking about. There's a lot of education, preliminary education needs to go into that, because, I must confess, I'm here. I want to thank for the invitation. Bill Hughes is here somewhere. Bill sent me reams of material on this, and I tried to read it all, and what I realized is how little I know about it. And I like to think that I kind of know what's going on in certain things. So there's a big gap with sort of the suit and tie crowd in DC as to what really is real and what's not real. But in my experience, again, going back to the internet thing, we had all sorts of different interests running around, but they were able to get enough common ground to actually get the copyright laws updated to, keep the phone companies from being liable for copyright. Same thing can happen here. The challenge, though, then you're doing much more big companies. Here, it still seems like first generation, personality driven, handful of people got in on this early, made their money, and my sense is their DNA does not say, now I want to play team ball and sort of, people made a killing doing it their own way. They're not all of a sudden going to say, well, I'm going to hire some guy in a suit to tell me what to do, right? So that's another challenge, is culturally trying to figure out how to kind of pull the band together, and everybody gets a solo, but at a certain point you all have to kind of play the same song.
Yeah, some of us are cracking enough to do it. Well, I know we're at time. We do have some. Look forward to socializing with everyone later on this afternoon. We do have a lot of Kraken colleagues here down in Puerto Rico. They are not wearing suits and are a lot of fun. So I encourage
I'm not besmirching the suits.
you guys to reach out. Don, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the time. We look forward to continue the conversation. We hope you continue to be part of this conversation with the community. You've had such a meaningful impact on public policy and are a true patriot. And so thank you for your public service and putting our industry, despite the headwinds of the last 4 years, on a very positive footing to make progress and get regulatory clarity in the United States. So thank you very much, Don.
Sure. Thank you.